But what I am starting to see is a little bit of what happened on Monday, a lot more hope, a lot more being like, this is the president that we were hoping for.
Let's now welcome to the show Meaghan Mobbs, who's a former US paratrooper and an advocate and friend of Ukraine. She also happens to be the daughter of General Keith Kellogg, who's the Ukraine envoy for the United States. Meaghan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me again. It's a pleasure to be here.
Meaghan, thanks. So look, as a former service person, as a friend of Ukraine, your father, of course, is a US envoy to Ukraine. Do you reckon that Ukraine is now being let down by the USA?
So I want to lead with, obviously, I never speak for my father. I speak in my personal
Understood.
capacity.
Quite understood.
Always important to say. I don't. And here's why. I think that you've actually seen some remarkable shifts in the last 72 hours. I think the flurry of diplomatic activity here in DC, in particular with all of those European nations coming to DC, explaining why Ukraine matters, actually not just for Europe, but actually for the United States of America, was actually very impressive for the president. And you even saw him tweeting earlier today, and I just heard Mr. Gorka speaking right there, but you have the president tweeting out, talking about calling Russia an invader and saying that you can't win a war if you're only on defense. And so what I would say is the onus for all of this always belongs with the president. The president makes a decision. It's not going to be the undersecretary over the Department of Defense that makes the decision about security guarantees. And it's not going to be anybody else. This is going to rest with the president of the United States. And I think that, quite frankly, Monday was pivotal for a variety of reasons.
I mean, you make the point, and President Trump made the same point, that it was impressive to see so many European leaders flocking to Washington. They were there, in significant part to try to avoid seeing the president, as it were, sell out Ukraine and give too much ground to Putin, when you will recognize that.
So I think what they were trying to do, and I give a lot of credit, by the way, to Europe for stepping up, but I also give a lot of credit to the president. I mean, it was his first administration and now his current administration that looked at Europe and said, you guys talk great. You speak beautifully about the importance of all of this, about committing to defense, but you're actually not really putting literally where your mouth is. You call this an existential threat, but you're not treating it like one. And so to his credit, and I mean President Trump's credit, he's aggressively pushed Europe to do more. And I've always said that a strong Europe is good for America and a strong America is good for Europe. We need to be lockstep here. And only until very recently has Europe kind of woken up and said, you're absolutely right. We need to do better for our security, our safety. And I think that's what you see is this evolving relationship between Europe and America, in which we are agreeing upon the necessity of security and defense, which does mean a significant investment. And so I think you see the president coming out of the NATO summit earlier this year, feeling that warmness, feeling the willingness of Europe to truly step up. And that's why I do think they were so well received and so well regarded in the White House on Monday.
And you surely make a fair point when you say there is a need for European leaders to step up more so than they have, well, at almost any point, really, and to take more responsibility for Europe's defence and for the support and defence of Ukraine. That looks like a very fair point. But though, Meaghan, I mean, you know Ukraine, you've got a lot of friends in Ukraine. The view of America there under the Trump administration, it's rather declined, hasn't it? What are you picking up now?
It is true. I mean, and I've said this, I think that there is a lot of fear and hesitation. And quite frankly, I think that it is very difficult for anyone outside of Ukraine who's either, right now I'm obviously currently in America, but even obviously when I'm in Ukraine, I'm still an American. I think it's very difficult for any outsider to try to tap into what it feels like to be Ukrainian in this moment. They are exhausted. That doesn't mean that I think that they are losing, or certainly doesn't mean that I think that their morale is low, but it's been 3.5 years of a long slog. And I think there was a lot of Ukrainians, actually know there were a lot of Ukrainians that were very hopeful for President Trump coming in. And that's because in his first administration, there was a sharp pivot away from what President Obama did. Like, let us not forget that under President Obama, again, exceptional rhetoric. He speaks beautifully, but you saw both the annexation of Crimea, and you saw the invasion of the Donbass under President Obama's watch. And he also prevented the direct delivery of lethal aid to Ukraine at that time. And then you saw President Trump come in. You obviously hear quite often spoken about the provision of javelins, which were critical in the first days of the full-scale invasion. And so they remember that, and they remember kind of that peace through strength that we saw in the first Trump administration. So I think there was a lot of hope and expectation that when President Trump came in, it was going to be much more out the gate aggressive. And so I do think there's a lot of disappointment disappointment and fear. Now, what I would just temper that by is that the president has always committed to diplomacy. Like I am one of those people that thinks that you have to talk to President Putin. You absolutely have to have that conversation because you're not going to settle the war without him coming to the table.
Yes.
President Trump is the only president that could do that. And so that was a critically important thing, was to have that face-to-face conversation. And then the bilateral and trilateral. I don't think that bilateral is going to happen, just to be very clear. But I do think that that trilateral and the presence of the U.S. is critically important. So back to your question, that was a long way around the barn, but there is disappointment. But what I am starting to see is a little bit of what happened on Monday, a lot more hope, a lot more being like, this is the president that we were hoping for.
Well, if you are right that Vladimir Putin really has no intention of sitting down with Volodymyr Zelensky, and I think you are right about that. Isn't it also a sign that Putin simply does not want peace? That seems to be the view of Ukrainians. You care about this, your friends care about this, and they're right about that, aren't they? Putin is not looking for peace.
Of course not. He's been very clear about that. He's basically said Ukraine is Russia. This is critical for our security, right? Just even last night, they launched a massive missile and drone barrage. It destroyed a American-owned company's manufacturing facility in Western Ukraine, nowhere near the front. So it's very, very clear that Putin is not trying for peace. He is doing exactly what the president has said that he thinks that Putin is doing, which is tapping him along. President Putin is trying to gain more initiative on the battlefield. They're trying to take more land so that they can say that this land is actually theirs.
Well, Meaghan, President Trump told President Macron of France that he thought Putin may be looking for peace in Ukraine out of consideration and regard for him, for Trump. That is what he's reliably reported to have said. That would be a remarkable view, surely.
So I think that what President Trump has always relied on is personal relationships. He deeply believes that personal relationships, more than almost anything, can get people to the table and have these open and frank conversations.
But he's deluded if he believes that, surely.
I think that he's not being well served at times by people overstating the capability of Russia. And what I mean by that is that I think there is still a persistent belief, by the way, both in our defense, and I'm not saying about Secretary Hegseth, and I'm not saying about Secretary Radcliffe, I'm saying at lower levels, I think that there is a persistent belief that Russia is much stronger than it actually is, that they are capable of doing more. And what my fear is that the truth is not being presented to the president as concretely as Russia is not as strong as they say they are. They are not capable of retaining or conquering that remaining 35% of Donetsk, what they're just asking for, right? So that's one of their demands, like, please give me that remaining 35%. It would take another million Russian lives, and it would take 4.5 years at least in order for them to even conquer that portion, outside of all of the other reasons why Ukraine should not give it up. And what I hope is that those advisors are being very aggressive and saying, Russia isn't the military force we think it is. Don't believe that they are this amazing, unconquerable, unstoppable force. It's just simply not true.
Okay, pleasure to talk to you, Meaghan. Thank you.